these poems as a collection are so inviting. And I think there are different ways that a poet can go about being inviting. It can come like a letter, and then you have to show up and you're welcome. These really read like you are next to the person.
What we lost in the swamp. Boys do not kiss boys, they catch frogs, is what I told myself the second it happened. And there we were, hidden in the hemlocks of a secret swamp, your lips drifting away from mine like a silent ship leaving harbor, gone as quickly as it came. I watched the shame leap into the pond of your face. Oh, the ripples. How good we were at turning moments into paper, into things we could crumple up and throw away. You grabbed the frog squirming in my palms and headed to the cave, to the crack between the rocks where the black and white striped garter snake slithered into shade. How I wish I could say that I stopped you, that I didn't watch unhinged jaws spring out like lightning, wrap around that poor and unsuspecting frog, but I did. Still too young to believe it. I wanted to see it gone, eaten, that green and slippery part of myself buried in the belly of a beast.
Grant, it's so lovely to have you here and to talk about this work, What We Lost in the Swamp. Just an interesting grouping of poems and world you created. This sort of like swamp frog theme is something that sort of carries a lot of the poems. Is that something for you that came first? Was it something that you had when you had certain feelings before writing a poem? You felt like a frog, or you felt like you were part of this world, and then it came onto paper, or was it a way to sort of form your ideas?
This actually was the first poem that I wrote for this collection, believe it or not.
Wow.
Yes. I wrote this poem and just, I remember calling my best friend Kaylin after, because I just was so, one of those poems that you write and you're like, ooh, I love it. And you want to just read it immediately to someone. And it became sort of the core that where the rest of these poems kind of grew from. I didn't set out to write a book that had, you know, almost in retrospect did I see, you know, a lot of these poems are green, and there's this theme of green, the color green, and animals and plants. But I think what I was really going for was sort of exploring the relationship between the queer experience and the natural world. And I think in this poem specifically, you sort of see how the queer experience or queer people don't feel comfortable in these heteronormative spaces that they live in, that they grow up in, and therefore nature and the forest and a park and a pond in the middle of the woods ends up being a place, a safe haven where queer people can escape to sort of give in to desire, to let their mask slip off for a second, and let themselves be witnessed as their true selves by the trees, by the squirrels, by, you know, the frogs, without fear of judgment. And what I think with this poem specifically is that it's like a younger queer speaker, and so therefore they're using that natural landscape as a safe space, but the problem is that they have sort of the norms of heteronormative society still ingrained in them, so they sort of bring that judgment and that fear and that shame into the space. So they sort of, and that's where the sort of self-policing or the self-awareness or self-censoring comes in at the end of the poem.
There's this really intimate relationship with this frog figure, and I'm just wondering if anything consciously you really identified with frog, or if you did research. I know a lot of poets do research to inform their work. So did you sort of go down a frog rabbit hole, or was it just something?
Now I need to go down a frog rabbit hole. I did not. I mean, something that I did as a child a lot was catch frogs, and I think that is something that, like, this is based off of a true, true experiences. I grew up in New Jersey, and we sort of had lots of little woods and areas where, as kids we could go into and catch frogs and just explore, the woods. And I also feel like in culture and society, and especially media, sort of catching frogs, being boy and catching frogs, and the girls being scared of the frog, like that's sort of a tropey thing that you see, and it's this image of, I guess you could say, masculinity that I feel like I'm reflecting on in the book, and that what does it mean to be a boy catching frogs, and also like the other boy that you're catching frogs with, or have desire for that boy. And so the frog, I think in the last line of the poem, it's the green and slippery part of myself. So the frog kind of symbolizes that thing that is hard to catch and grasp onto. And in this moment, the frog, sometimes the frog jumps out of your hand and you can't control it and you can't keep it. And that kind of, to me, was symbolic of that self. And in this poem, they even feed the frog to the snake in this kind of darker turn where they're just really not ready to sort of hold on or keep that part of themselves, or at least the speaker isn't.
This poem in particular has a real duality of desire, denial, presence loss. There's lots going on here. Was that something when you wrote it, you were trying to straddle those two things? You were trying to both hold and give up, or were you more focused just on the belonging, like the idea of going to this place and belonging?
We both went to the same MFA program at Antioch, and I wrote this book before going into that program. So that was before, now as a poet I have a plethora of knowledge and experience and vocabulary in terms of craft. And I think back then when I wrote these poems in 2020, before school, I didn't really have that language. Everything was sort of based off of gut instinct and gut feeling, and just, so it's interesting to now look at these poems from a craft aspect, because I don't think I was as aware of, consciously aware of the craft. But I don't...
That brings a sense of innocence, too.
Yeah.
Which I think makes these poems, and we'll get into this after you read the next one, but they're so charming to read. Even the darker ones, even the more explicit ones, they still have an inherent charm. So maybe that was there, too.
Yeah, I think it definitely was. I think I was reading poets like Chen Chen during this time, too, who's very fun and energetic, and it weaves emotion so well that it's not like all of his poems have a quote-unquote face. Like, it's not just about a happy or sad poem. Like, they're funny and delightful, and then heart-wrenching at the end. And so that was a huge inspiration for this book, those types of poems. And yeah, I think the duality, I think I was searching for the duality, and that's what the poem...
You found it.
Yeah, that's what the poem ended up doing, because I think this was a memory of I guess loss, and thinking back on my childhood, and I was so suppressed. I suppressed my true self for so long that looking back, this was me kind of looking back at those memories and thinking, like, what was really going on? What was really happening? What was I really feeling in these moments? What were both of us feeling, and why did it end up this way? And then, and even in poems I'm writing currently, it's sort of wondering, like, what could have changed? What could I have done? What would I be like now as a poet, as a human, if things had gone a different way? And I didn't come out till I was 25 years old. So, that's half of my 20s, almost more than half of my 20s spent sort of pretending to be... I was around that
same age too, if that makes you feel better.
Yeah,
and I think,
thank you.
I think that's common with, I don't want to just blanket millennials, but
Yeah.
I think there's other generations that were either way later or way earlier, and everyone that at least I've talked to that's around our age, it seems like mid-20s, sometimes late 20s, were kind of that space.
Yeah. My first date with another man was awkward. The two of us, like little teacups, still fresh from the cupboard, sitting across from one another without a clue of what to do or how to act. Me with my ball cap, I tried to read this Cali surfer bro, but the swelling in my throat became distracting. How uncomfortable we must have seemed, the two of us still holding our own internalized homophobia like great big onions in our hands, hovering, both scared of the stench, of the sour, stinging eyes those layered lies could bring. By the end, I knew he liked me, not because he told me or passionately kissed me. He did neither. It was when he walked me to my car, how he stopped to sheepishly ask if we could take another lap around the block.
These poems as a collection are so inviting, and I think there are different ways that a poet can go about being inviting. It can come like a letter, and then you have to show up and you're welcome. These really read like you are next to the person, like they're the one sitting there. They're also the one you're asking to walk around the block. So there's being warm and welcoming, and then there's just inclusion. Like as a reader, I just felt so included in these moments. Is that something you feel like you have as a writer across the board? Is that something you want to keep, or you're exploring other styles, or is that something you've even noticed reading these poems back, just how warm they are?
Oh, thank you for saying that. I think any poet wants to hear a reader say that they feel included and that the poems are warm and inclusive. I don't think I was necessarily I think now looking at the book as a whole after the fact, I think I look at it and go, oh, this is such like I sort of was writing my story, and now in doing so, it kind of has opened up for other people to connect to and see themselves in. Like there's not so many queer stories out there, and especially ones that are more delightful or have sort of like the highs and the lows, but the joys along with like the sadder moments. And I think, I think it feels important to me now. Like I have moved forward and have sort of used that. It took me a while to even adopt the kind of, not title, but label of queer poet. Like I feel like you and I have talked about this before too, and to me I'm like, yeah, I'm absolutely gonna call myself that. And because I feel readers have reached out to tell me how much the book has meant to them, and that is something that I think is important. Obviously, I'm writing the poems for myself too, but if they can provide some sort of like peace or warmth or companionship to someone who is somewhere else in their life, because as much as we think that times have gotten better, I think places like Florida and other states, it's still very difficult. And I had someone, like a young queer person, reach out from Florida saying how much like the book meant to them, and how like it's harder for someone like that to find community. So I think to have a book like that is so important. And this is sort of the book that I wish that I had. I often think like, what would I have done if I had been able to read this when I was in middle school or beginning high school. I remember when I was 25, secretly getting a copy of Call Me By Your Name and reading it in my room secretly. I had two straight roommates at the time who are great, and I love them, but I wasn't comfortable walking around showing that. So just locking my door and reading through it, and so those, I think it's so important, the stories that help us feel. I think it makes you feel alive inside because you're feeling seen and you're feeling excited by the possibility. You're seeing the possibilities of love and desire and joy, I think, is so important.
Can you sort of talk about this collection, its origin story, and then its recent sort of second life, second breath that it's gotten?
Yeah, sure. This is a collection that I wrote at the beginning of the pandemic. I think it was July of 2020, and everyone was, locked down. And I just found myself, like so many people during that time, turning to nature and going for walks and just thinking, being outside more and just noticing things. I think we all were forced to not only reckon with the fact that millions of people were dying, and this was and it was just chaos. But the fact that we were kind of stuck in our lives in pause on many different levels, and were forced to kind of look around for the first time. And I don't think I even went for walks before that, which is wild. And so I think I just suddenly felt very inspired as I was noticing all the little things around me. And I had self-published a book called He Felt Unwell, so he wrote this prior to this one. And it was sort of short micro poems, and my friend illustrated it, and it was very fun. And it touches upon queer topics, but I think this book was specifically a lot more autobiographical, and I really wanted to kind of dive into the kind of the silence of my past and my childhood, because I was so suppressed for so long, and I needed to write this to figure it out. And I had self-published a version of it that then got picked up by a publisher, Central Avenue Publishing, which I'm so thankful for, and has had this new life. The Garden Gate. I have been into the weeds and seen it. The slight, nondescript and paper-thin difference between confidence and feeling good enough. Will I ever have the latter, I always ask, or does this ladder never end? Step after step after step, until I'm seasick, swaying up high in the deep blue sky, full of wind and nothingness. I want to be so many things in my life. I've made a list. Soft as the fuzzy cattail's tip, brave as the bracing pin-thin nail, always standing up to the hammer's heavy hit. I want to feel at home everywhere I go, like the slow-moving snail, a sand crab, fast and uncatchable, forever leaving me squatting at the water's edge, believing in a new and beachy magic. I know this will sound strange, but most of all, I want to be the garden gate, not the tall and steely wall out front that opens on its own, but the old and wooden thing out back, with the little black metal latch that always moans at the feeling of your hands. Maybe that is all it really takes. Feeling good enough for you, because of you, your gentle touch, and the rest just falls into place.
There's a real vulnerability. Like this poem feels like an exhale, where other ones maybe feel like a breath, and other ones feel like an inhale, the fear and holding your breath. This really just feels so incredibly vulnerable that I think the other ones do.
Yeah.
But there's something in this that's less about other people and less about the self and other people, even though there's a you in here. But especially the line, I want to feel at home everywhere I go, like a snail. The weight of that, the weight of thinking people don't feel at home anywhere they go.
Yeah.
So for this one, was there a conscious switch in tone? Did this one feel like a special poem in this collection? Does this have like a particular meatiness to it that maybe you had while reading it, or even now with an aerial view can see?
Yeah, I think you bring up such a good point. I feel like I wrote it as this sort of meandering love poem. Like it ends up being sort of a love poem, and it's sort of a love poem to my now husband, but then also like a love poem to nature too, because it's just sort of trying to find the self and ground the self in the natural world and like what's important, which is sort of feeling connected to the world, to other beings, to your loved ones. Like it's sort of bringing it back to like what's important. And I think what I didn't realize is that it also could read, like you were saying, as sort of a love poem to the self. I know it talks about sort of like the feeling of your hands, but it really does seem like this poem is learning to be at home in your own body and your own life, and finally feeling, because the form itself is sort of broken fragments that kind of float across the page. There's this like stepping stone, this sort of breadcrumb journey until you sort of fall into place with the meaning of the poem, which is, oh, it's about loved ones, it's about loving myself, it's about feeling okay. Like if I don't always have to be so hard on myself, I can sort of, I don't always have to feel confident, I don't always have to feel, the best, and that's okay. I'm still living, and that's what's great.
And I think for me, it's the words want and the words will that make it so pleading. Like to me, it sounds vulnerable and pleading in a way, as opposed to I feel at home everywhere I go, or I do feel at home everywhere I go. It's like I want this, or I will this to happen. Where I feel like that's what makes this poem so raw to me is because it shows there's like a dreaming of or like a reaching towards something. Yeah,
like a manifesting. I think we always sort of, once you speak something into the ether, sometimes that helps it come true. And you have to sort of, I think what is the listingness of the poem is the speaker so almost like setting goals and realizing, you can't have what you want if you don't know what you want, right? So let's write out what we want, what we yearn for, and that's what poetry is so good at doing, is us sort of realizing
life advice.
Life advice, or we talk about the discovery of a poem as poets, and that's sort of what I feel in this poem is like the discovering of our not inner peace, but this like satisfaction with life that's happening,
or the path of it.
Yeah, the process, the journey of it, and being more present and paying more attention, because that is how you can become the X, Y, and Z is really the first start, is being present and looking at it. The year I volunteered at a hospice care. I visited blank again today, the empty space, because legally I cannot give the name of a person in hospice. What I can say, though, is how beautifully strange it is to sit with someone dying. How every sunny Sunday I come to read her poems, play her music from my phone, but mostly I'm there to hold the space. Her hand, if heavy eyes decide to weep or sleep. She cannot speak or understand the words I say, so the only things I know about her are her name, her age, the fact that she is dying. It sounds so strange, but it took until today's visit for me to finally realize that could be the most I ever get. I will probably never know her favorite color, favorite food, all the places she's been to, if she likes to dance, and if she does, with whom. How did you meet the love of your life? I whisper into the ether, as if my softer tone might work, might slip those words beneath the closed door between us. Of course, I never get an answer, but I take in all the things I can. Long silver hair, crooked bottom teeth, how her sea-green eyes seem to smile back at me. I'm well aware this final page is all I'll read. But if I just capture all these smaller things, the bits and pieces I can see, if heaven's a collection of other people's memories, then hers will be a little bigger.
There's so much that I want to talk about with this poem in particular. At first, when I read it, I thought, wow, this is different. This is different than the frogs and the swamp and the queer experience. And then it just all made sense because of that. Maybe I didn't have that word, but companionship. It seems like you were learning how to be a companion to yourself, and then learning how to be a companion in a relationship, in relationships. And then all of a sudden, Wise Grant, I guess I'm aging you here too, but Wise Grant is sitting with this person doing companionship. It went from learning and practicing to the doing. Like you were a companion to this person, whether they heard you or not, saw you or not. And what made this poem fall into this collection?
you have this journey of the coming out and the dating men and being more comfortable with the self. And then I feel like in this last section, it sort of opens up into more philosophical themes about death and relationships, not necessarily from a queer perspective, but just these like deeper truths that the speaker, I feel like once, as queer people, we're so focused inward on the self and the coming out journey and our own shame and how we're seen, that then like once we sort of feel settled, we do so much work feeling settled in our own bodies and our own lives that I feel like once that does happen, there is this moment of being able to like look up and look around. And I think that that's what that section and this poem in particular is trying to do. I'm someone that is afraid of death, and I write a lot about
me
death.
too.
And, yeah, and I think writing about it helps too, right? I think I found a lot of relief in like writing these fears and these experiences on paper and thinking like, okay, that's on paper now, and it's not rattling inside me, or I have a better understanding of death. I guess I consider myself an atheist, and so that's probably what makes death so scary to me, is the sort of the nothingness of it all and just not existing and trying to be like, how is that possible? How does, I shouldn't be scared. If I just stop existing, then there's nothing to be scared of. But I still kind of have to grapple with that, and I think I sort of found a version in the end of the poem, the idea of that if we live on in people's memories, like the bits and pieces of us, like the more people that you sort of touch or just engage with or that are your companions, your loved ones, like the more you sort of live on in this sort of like scattered quilt of heaven in a way. And I think that was comforting.
You say like if heaven is a collection of other people's memories. That line is killer. There are a lot of killer lines in these poems, but that's definitely one of them. And wow, what a true poet, that even though you're an atheist, you're like, this poem calls for these words and these lines to capture that sentiment. So thank you for sharing this poem with the world and this collection with the world. And there's companionship in all of it, and there's love in all of it. And what a gift that we get to receive it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And thank you for being such a close reader and having such great questions.